All right, boys. So is it even remotely possible that womanizing or promiscuity could be even slightly comparable to something like a needle sharing addict? It sounds insane, right? I thought so too. But then I started to pick up on some pretty twisted and alarming patterns that made me start to consider and realize that the comparison and equivalence here was way closer than I was even prepared to admit to myself. So I'm a 36-year-old man now. I've been single most of my life. I've had a few long-term relationships, but nothing really lasting over a year and a half. For the rest of the time, to put it bluntly, I've been womanizing. Not obsessively, not to a level that it was taking over the other things that I had prioritized in my life, like business and aspirations, goals, quality time with loved ones. But it was something that I did. I also made sure that I never lied. I was always very upfront and honest. So if a girl would ever ask me if I'm looking for something serious, I would always say no. And it was through this that I kind of developed my coping mechanism in my brain to convince myself that it was no problem. I'm telling the truth, I'm being transparent, and it's all consensual, it's all above board. But somewhere along the way, it started to become very cold and meaningless. And through that and through other things in my life that was directing me to basically form a closer relationship with God, it became very apparent that this practice was not bringing me anywhere positive. So as time went on, that confidence and the satisfaction that I would get from those acts started to turn more into guilt and shame, honestly. And the more I tried to control it, this was the mind-blowing thing to me, because I consider myself a very disciplined person. But the more I tried to exercise discipline or control it, the more out of hand and the more out of control it became. So I was actually left there sitting thinking, is this an addiction? I'm also a person who has a very anti-addictive personality. I've never been addicted to anything in my life that I couldn't just say, I'm not doing this anymore, and I stopped doing it. But in this case, I started to look at it honestly and think, this definitely fits a lot of the characteristics that are described of addiction. So honestly, probably to make myself feel better, I started to compare it. I like to do this thing in my mind. It's a pretty extreme practice, but I like to just visit each opposite end of the spectrum and try and put into perspective this thing that I'm looking at for the moment. So I started to compare other addictions. And the most extreme example of that I could come up with was a needle sharing addict. And at first I was saying to myself, that's addiction. This is what I'm doing. It's very minor. It's very mild. But the more I started to look at it, the closer I realized the comparison was. Because at the end of the day, it carries the same risks, both physical and spiritual. We depend for our safekeeping very thin barriers. Somebody's word, maybe a pill, maybe a piece of silicon. And then on the other side of it, you really don't know what this person was up to. Where have they been? Who else has she been sharing these intimate moments with? We don't know these things. We assume, but this led me to realize this is actually scarily close to the worst form of, for example, needle sharing. And once I realized this, it was honestly like I got hit with a ton of bricks. There was a wake-up call, because I'd always done it. I've always found a way in the past to justify it to myself and diminish it, minimize looking at it for what it really was. But basically using cope in my mind, like maybe I'd been lucky enough to not experience any negative health effects in the past. But does that mean that that's going to continue into the future? Who's guaranteeing that? And I could also imagine an addict doing that same mental game with themselves. Like, it's all right, it's been working out this far along, why not a little bit further? And that was the wake-up call I needed. But the crazy thing being, the more I tried to take control of it, the more out of my control it began. So along the way, as I said, gaining a deeper relationship with God, reading the scriptures and really delving into these ideas and these concepts theologically, I started to understand that this had to stop. But I was also understanding that I did not have the power to stop it. So I turned to people in my circle. I started to ask people who had been on this abstinent journey. And basically they told me that they were in the same shoes that I am now at that time. And the only way they were able to make a change was through the assistance and power of God. And that if I wanted that same assistance, all I had to do is ask and He would show up. So knowing that I could gain assistance for this potentially, but still fighting against the reality of the situation that I was in, I didn't want to accept it. There's a lot of pride, there's a lot of identity, there's a lot of ego that's on the line here when we're looking at ourselves very, very introspectively, very critically. And I didn't want to accept that. But it was very clear to me that what I was trying wasn't working. So to cut to the chase, a few months later, I really reached a kind of breaking point with it. And I had this fear in the past that I knew God was true. I knew there had to be a creator. And the idea, it seemed that every road was pointing to Jesus Christ specifically as being the true living God. But I didn't want to accept it because it meant giving up my autonomy. It meant giving up my authority. But I had this fear that I would have to lose everything, because that's such a common story, yeah? Especially in Christianity, that people hit rock bottom. Everything's gone from their life. My life was great in all respects, except this one. But this one, the cancerous effects of it was leaking out into the other areas. So it wasn't until I reached a breaking point a few months later that led me pretty much in a point of misery and helplessness to finally accept it and admit. And then in my own quiet time, while putting myself through a torturous workout to deal with the adrenaline and the negative feelings that were built up in me, the feelings of guilt and shame, I did. I honestly and earnestly from my heart, I asked for help. I said, God, I need help. I accept. I admit it. I might have a lot of areas in my life under control, but this one, I don't. So help me. And if Jesus Christ is real, prove it to me. And He did. In asking Him to take that yoke from me, it was literally a matter of a few days until that almost oppression that I was feeling started to lift. And then within a couple of weeks to a few weeks of seeking deeper relationship to God, and this feeling of actually being relieved from the pressure and the stress and the control of that desire, I started to come more and more accepting of the fact that this is not okay, and I can actually go for a very, very long extended period of abstaining from it altogether. So that's my, say, testimony in this regard. And to get a little bit deeper on this topic, let's actually look at what are some of the other elements at play here, both in these sexual gratification acts and in addiction to substances. There's a very similar pattern, and that is that first of all, they fire off, every time we engage, they fire off the same mental pathways, the dopamine, the endorphins, the serotonin. And then through that, we almost become numb and we become desensitized, needing to kind of up the ante as far as the fix is concerned. On the substance side, it seems that the doses need to keep getting upped more frequently, higher doses, sometimes even harsher compounds to get that same rush. And on the promiscuity side, it's kind of just chasing that next partner. It's this rinse and repeat pattern or habit that is actually satisfying less and less over time, not more and more, even if the frequency and the intensity increases. So the tolerance and dependency goes up, but the meaning becomes completely lost over time. And then on the spiritual side, we are designed spiritually to be in covenant, man and woman in covenant with one another. So when we engage in these very meaningless and connectionless acts, it's actually our spirit that becomes more and more decayed or frayed over time. We become desensitized to connection in the same way that a junkie becomes numb to life. There's a very deep verse in the Bible that hits on this precisely, and that's 1 Corinthians 6:16. And it says, "Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh." And obviously this is talking about specifically a prostitute, but this speaks to a spiritual reality that is overlooked, obviously, and especially in today's day and age. The uniting of the flesh is actually spiritual in the same sense. There's two sides to that coin. It's not merely a physical act that carries no spiritual consequences. And in fact, the spiritual consequences are far more impactful than the physical ones. And this highlights the spiritual warfare because in today's society, it's pushed that these behaviors are not only normal, but they're a symbol of success. That women participating in this are somehow liberated from chains and shackles, which is ridiculous on its face. And men, the more women he's able to sleep with is almost like a trophy cabinet. And that the amount equivocates to his ability, his power, his capability as a man. But more women does not equal more success. Even though I saw it that way for a very, very long time. Because these acts all originate from a place of pride, not truth. And something that I would always fall back on, especially as I was getting closer to God, but I was still engaging in these behaviors, is that so many great men in the Bible engaged in these activities with extra wives, with harems and concubines and the rest of it. But it only takes to look a little bit deeper to realize that these are cautionary tales. These are some of the greatest men to have ever existed, that their names are immortalized in these texts. But at the same time, they all fall to the same thing, which is lust. That takes us back to the spiritual warfare side of things. The more we engage in these desires of the flesh, the further we get away from the spiritual design that God had for us in the first place, which comes through alignment and truth and love. The truth is that it's only through disciplining these desires, these fleshly desires, that we actually get closer to our divine purpose. Because when we indulge them, we get further away, we get further disconnected, we get further lost and confused. So where does that lead us? It leads us to feeling more disconnected. So basically nothing feels sacred anymore. Nothing feels special. It makes us feel more numb. It makes us feel less willing to connect. It breeds an unwillingness to commit. And then ultimately, an inability to bond deeply because our receptors are just fried. But there is a way out. Maybe not for all of us, but I think for a lot of us, if you're a red-blooded man, then God will be required at some point to seek a source of order and truth. Because the first step is awareness. Even just accepting that this thing that we're doing is not good. It's not good for us. It's not good for the girls. And it's not good in the general context of the world, of society as a whole. And then it's to abstain. It's to not partake in this. And then from there, we allow our minds to start a process of renewal or restructuring and recalibrating. If you try that yourself and it doesn't work out, then you can ultimately ask for help. And that's my challenge to you. That's a challenge for anybody. If you are on the fence, if you're doubting a little bit, if you're unsure, whether it's unsure of yourself or unsure of the existence of God, simply ask. In your own quiet time, in your own personal space, honestly and earnestly ask for Him to show up. Because I guarantee He will. I'm not saying it's going to be all easy street from there on out. It's not. It's hard to deny the flesh. It's hard to stay aligned with God's divine plan. That's why our society is so heavily built around rejecting it and doing the opposite. But it does bring a peace and fulfillment and a joy that's unattainable by doing it any other way. Because running through women is not power at the end of the day. In reality, it's actually submission to a lesser entity, to lesser beings, unseen beings and entities that infect us through the suggestion of thought to bring their will into reality, through convincing us that our flesh is king. But there is only one king. And by denying our flesh, we give ourselves the opportunity to come into relationship and alignment with that king. That ultimate truth about what it is to be a man, to be a real man, is not about conquering women. It's actually about conquering ourselves. So I'm going to leave it there. As always, like, subscribe, comment, all the good stuff. And let me know if you want to see me go off in any tangents on side tangents here. I'll probably do a longer version of my testimony as well. But that's just a part of it. So until the next one, God bless.